G'day you mob, and welcome back to Aussie English, the number one place for everyone and anyone wanting to wrap their heads around Australian English, as well as get their fair dose of Aussie culture, history, news and current affairs, and in this case, paleoecology. So today's guest is Dr. Scott Hocknull, who is a vertebrate paleoecologist, a passionate science communicator, and a 3D digitization and virtual technology advocate and practitioner at the Queensland Museum. He has an incredible story growing up in the Northern Territory, but I'll let you get into that in this interview. I saw him in the news recently talking about some recent research that he got published about megafauna in Australia. What are they? How they were living together. We talk about their interactions with Indigenous people, and then also how they went extinct, how they went the way of the dodo. Now, before we get into this episode, guys, we did have a few audio issues where the audio got a little crackly in a few spots, so forgive me for that. I still did my best to get things back on and get them working because this was just an absolutely fascinating conversation. So, Scott, thank you so much for coming on. Guys, smack the bird. Let's go. G'day you mob, welcome to this episode of Aussie English. Today I have Dr. Scott Hocknull from Geosciences Department of the Queensland Museum. Welcome. How are you going, Scott?
I'm doing fantastic, Pete. How are you going?
I'm good. So I recently saw a news article of yours that was making the rounds in the Australian news and was a great break from COVID, I tell you what.
It was certainly a story that broke some good news, but whether it was a story of fantastic, lovely things, I'm not really sure about that.
No, it was brilliant. But before we get into the story, I guess, how did you end up the youngest curator at an Australian museum at the age of 22? Well,
it actually starts back from when I was a kid. As a lot of biologists and paleontologists would tell you that they've had a passion for science since they were a little kid. And I grew up in Darwin in the Northern Territory. And in fact, that's exactly where I got my passion for natural history and giant animals. I mean, I lived alongside people that had the crocodile as their totem, the Gumatj people in the Northern Territory in Nhulunbuy. I read books about dinosaurs. I watched Sir David Attenborough do some amazing documentaries on fossils. And I was just surrounded by it as a kid, and I just was fascinated by these gigantic extinct animals. Now, I thought I had no chance of actually even seeing that as a job. In fact, when I came down to Queensland to start high school, boarding school, my teachers were telling me that paleontology wasn't even a career path, that it didn't actually exist. But I got to meet a paleontologist at the Queensland Museum when I was 12 years old. And he showed me the collection, he showed me the fossils. I was just absolutely gobsmacked by how cool these things were. And of course, I was dying to ask him, well, how can I be a paleontologist? How can I work with fossils? And he said, you've got three chances of being a paleontologist. The first chance is if someone dies and you can take their job. I was like, oh, okay, that's no good. If someone retires, then maybe you can take their position. Or if, of course, you have really rich parents and they can look after you for the rest of your life. And I didn't have two of those. I wasn't going to commit murder, and I certainly didn't have rich parents. So I actually asked him how old he was. And he told me how old he was, and then I turned to my dad and said, how old do you have to be till you retire? And so he figured it out, and I went, well, if I work really hard, in 10 years' time, he's going to retire, and maybe I'll be in a position to apply for his job. And sure enough, by 10 years later, age 22, his job did come up, and I applied for it, and I was very, very fortunate to be offered the position as a curator at a museum, and I've been there ever since. 20 years this day, or this year, and 30 years since I actually started volunteering for the museum. So I start from that day on, from when he said, you can be a paleontologist at any age, I started volunteering. So 12 years old, I went to the museum and I would prepare fossils and look for things. And by the age of 16, I was finding new species of fossil animals and writing papers and all this sort of cool stuff. So I was very fortunate. I had great mentors, but most importantly, I just was dedicated. I I kept wanting to see my dreams come true. And little did I know that actually it would translate into not only being a paleontologist, but finding new dinosaurs and finding gigantic megafauna species and uncovering things that no one in Australia had ever found before. So that always gives me goosebumps to think that as a little kid, I just had this idea, and sort of this really naive idea that there might be an opportunity to do it. And now I can offer that opportunity for others and other kids and wanting to do the science themselves.
So have you had any kids come in and have an interview with you and be like, you thinking about leaving anytime soon?
Yeah. Or how old are you? I said, well, sorry, you've got about 25 years before I retire. And the way the retirement age is going, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. So, but having said that, one of the cool things is that all of these new dinosaur discoveries and the megafauna discoveries out in Western Queensland and in fact across Australia is generating a new passion for regional museums and collections. So what we're finding is perhaps not in standard museums, but in in the areas of the outback where tourism is a major driver, where fossils are found in context, we actually get an opportunity to build museums and be out there with them. And that's where most of the jobs are at the moment, to be a guide where you can guide people with fossils, be actually hands-on preparing them, be involved with that whole thing. So what's really interesting now is that if a kid comes to me and asks me about being a paleontologist, I say, well, what sort of paleontologist actually? But back when I was a kid, it was, well, you had to be a museum curator, but now we can be a paleo tourist, tour guide. You can be a paleo artist. You can be a 3D animator. You can be any number of things that uses your skills in paleontology to get a job in a whole range of really cool things. You can go to Hollywood if you really want to as well. So there's a whole range of really neat job prospects from a passion surrounding extinct giant animals and the cool stuff paleontology brings.
It must be annoying, though, in terms of Hollywood and wanting to make any of the animals, I guess, work on their appearance because it's something that's going to date pretty badly, right? Like with Jurassic Park, you even saw that, I think, in the Jurassic Park films, that the dinosaurs become more heavily feathered.
Yeah, and what's funny is that I remember seeing Jurassic Park when I was 16 and going, wow, isn't that cool? Mostly because not only were these dinosaurs quite accurate for as far as we knew at that time, but they were just so lifelike and animated. And ironically, as you went through each of the Jurassic Parks, they do get feathers and they do start to play with the concepts of what dinosaurs would look like. Now, I don't want to be called old school, but Jurassic World goes the complete opposite direction, and the dinosaurs suddenly turn into being plastic things with lumbering, floppy skin and no feathers, no real nuance to these amazing creatures that clearly were very dynamic, very behaviorally interesting, very colourful, full of feathers, full of weird spikes and crazy integument, things that we now find with fossils that actually prove that they did have it. So it's kind of to and fro. When Jurassic Park first came out, it was like, wow, yeah, we're onto a good thing. And in fact, a lot of the interest around dinosaurs nowadays, when I talk to students coming through, Jurassic Park was a real kick for them. The Walking with Dinosaurs was a real kick for them. Those sorts of documentary style aspects where bringing CGI and animation into the front is really, really a major part. But none of it gets around a good story. And that's the point with the paleontology that we do at the moment, is you've got to be able to tell the story with facts and be able to back that up with the evidence. And that's, I suppose, the key thing with most kids nowadays is when they want to find a dinosaur or they want to be a part of paleo, that's great. But when they realise the actual grunt work and the decades of painstaking chipping away, and it's not a case of just dusting off the specimen and going, hey, look at this, hey, we can 3D print out the larynx of a velociraptor and start communicating with one another. No.
Yeah, that was crazy, right? Where they're like, this is how it would sound. And you're like, oh, God, guys, what are you doing? What are you doing?
And what's amazing is that some of that stuff is really based on some really good science and good fact. But, yeah, I mean, take a leap. And
I
away
think
we
I've
go.
seen some of the really cool stuff in terms of running CAT scans on skulls to work out things like the nasal passage, to work out what they could smell, if they were visual predators, and the same with, like, I think with T-Rex, working out the brain morphology based on
Yep.
the brain case to work out how was the visual aspect of the brain enlarged to suggest that it was very visual as well. And so it's really insane that you're taking I guess something that was medically used, and then you're using it to look at fossils to try and determine whether these creatures from the past were certain kinds of predators or not. It's insane,
Yeah,
right?
it is fascinating. I mean, one of the things that we do in paleontology all the time, and something that we learn a lot as students going through, is we hack everyone else's science. So we really try to use everyone else's really cool stuff to better ourselves.
Yeah.
So CT scanning has been around in paleontology for a long time, pretty much as soon as scanners and X-rays were invented. There was some paleontologists waiting to go, can I stick a fossil through it? I want to see what's inside. And of course, engineering software, the same software that engineers use to look at the rigidity of a building and how beams in a building might stop it from falling over, or the biomechanics of a human skeleton, looking at biomedical research, all of that amazing kit that's developed for real world applications today, we use that endlessly for paleontology to look at the breaking strain of bones of gigantic sauropod dinosaurs and whether they could have reared up on hind legs, or the fluid dynamics of a trilobite to find out how it swam or could it swim, and all these sorts of things. So, yeah, paleontology, it's a science for old and ancient life, but we're always at sort of the edge of trying to push the limits of what these scraps and clues from the past can actually tell us about what these animals were.
So what does your average day look like? If you had someone come in who's like, I just watched Jurassic Park and I saw the bit where he found a velociraptor claw in the ground. Is that all we have to do every single day? We just dig up awesome stuff. What is the sort of reality check there on what your average day looks like?
It's not that exciting, actually. Most of my average day is, as a public servant, is actually looking for funding, writing grants, collaborating. But as a curator, one of the key tasks here at the museum is to look after a huge collection. So we have a collection manager here who looks after the specifics about individual specimens. And we have curators who understand what each different group, for example, might be. And we only have two curators here for paleontology. So that's across all of life from the past. And now the state collection, so this is the collection of Queensland, there's around 7.5 million specimens. So we're one of the largest collections of rocks, fossils and minerals in the Southern Hemisphere.
Pretty big garage, right?
Yeah, it's a huge collection. And so when this paleontologist took me behind closed doors and showed me this amazing collection, I was just blown away because there were literally millions and millions of specimens there. 7.5 odd million specimens, one of the largest collections of rocks, fossils and minerals in the Southern Hemisphere. And one of the key and exciting parts of being a paleontologist is that you get to figure out new ideas of how to disseminate all of this to the public. So I calculated, just based on the number of specimens we have and the size of our exhibition, that we only put about 0.01% of the actual collection on display. And if we were to replace every single specimen on display each year with new material, it would take us somewhere in the order of 10,000 years to get from where we are now right back around to the beginning. And that's not without replacing those specimens with new ones that we find out in the field. So it's an impossible task, basically. The fossils are either too small or too big, there's too many of them. So what we use is new technology, whether that's CT scanning or three-dimensional modelling. We use photogrammetry, which creates 3D models of each of the specimens. And the idea is that in the future, we'll be able to put all these things out online in virtual collections and make everyone an opportunity, give everyone an opportunity to curate their own collection. So you can imagine logging in online and having your favourite fossils or favourite objects from the museum all curated in your own collection, and then having discussions with people and disseminating that interest, and also between researchers. I mean, you could imagine a researcher overseas that may not need to, or may not be able to come to Australia to research these things. And in fact, at the present time, under the COVID restrictions, is a really good point. There's a lot of PhD students that their research has been curtailed very quickly because they were supposed to be travelling here to look at specimens. And so, of course, the next thing they ask is, do you have a 3D model of this thing?
Yeah.
So that's a really important part of our job as museum curators and paleontologists, is to try and figure out ways to get this collection out there so that everyone can see it and everyone can appreciate it and research it.
So we'll get to the megafauna shortly, but before we do that, I wanted to ask you, because this was something I was constantly facing at Melbourne Museum or Museum Victoria when I was a PhD student there. Why do museums matter? You know, you would get questions from the public saying, why are we funding this? Why are we wasting money on museums?
It's a very good question. We're asked that all the time. And in fact, we have to justify our existence all the time. And think about it this way. A collection of objects is only a collection of objects if it has no real meaning for our present day. So, yeah, some people or many people may think that museums are just storehouses of stuff and that the people who work on them or curate them are hoarders. We go out and we collect things and then we hoard them away, and eventually we might go and put things on display and pontificate over how important they actually are. But there's some real value in a lot of the specimens that we have because they mark a particular period of time. And what that means, you can look back on that period of time, and if there's enough information captured in the specimens, the objects, it can actually give us an idea of where we're going in time. Now, in the zoological collections, the things you're probably working on, those collections are tens, hundreds, maybe even several thousands of years old, because they have material that starts with European arrival back to Aboriginal Australians all the way through to mummified or semi-preserved material in tundra and permafrost. These sorts of biological materials that actually exist through time preserve genetics, they preserve DNA, they preserve the responses of the animals and plants and environment to change over time. And then further back into the fossil record, you're seeing that change going backwards. So the further back you go, the further forward you can actually project. And that's the exciting thing about this particular museum, is that a natural history museum looks at the past to understand where we are today and gives us a context of who we are. So, for example, T-Rex. Everyone knows T-Rex. Everyone loves T-Rex. That's a global icon, and it wouldn't be around without a museum. But, of course, T-Rex is a North American dinosaur, and it gives context to people's identity in North America. Australian dinosaurs that are probably not as well known, but are as interesting and exciting, could give us our own identity, our own feeling of our national pride. And one of the interesting things about museums is it gives an opportunity for people that aren't scientists to literally get their hands dirty with a science that they can. So, for example, if you go out west to Western Queensland, you can be a part of a museum experience where you go from a dinosaur dig all the way through to the prep lab and even to the study of the dinosaurs without having to be a paleontologist at all. So what that gives you is a connection to country, a connection to your natural history, something that you can give back to your country that no other experience can. You can look at the stars and you can identify galaxies and things like that for, say, astronomers. But maybe you can name them, maybe you'll get it named after you. Perhaps there's a bit of connection there. But if you can actually find a fossil, you can find an extinct animal, you can find something that no one else has ever seen before and be a part of that whole journey, it gives you a connection to the place you live in that nothing else can. So museums are a really important and fundamental part of our society and our heritage, but for more than just a repository of cool and odd things that, maybe if you've got nothing else to do on the weekend, you can wander down to the museum and get in there and have a look. It's actually more to do with how we tell the changing story of our own content, how we fit within that picture. So changing the context of what museums are, there are They're a growing connection with our country and what it means to actually be an Australian outside and above individual culture or your family history or what have you. So everyone has that personal cultural connection to their past, but we as Australians have inherited a continent that's 4.5 billion years old, and it's one of the oldest continents on Earth, and it has an amazing, unique and completely isolated fauna and flora and all these crazy new things and exciting things, and we have to look after it. So where do you go to learn about that? Museums.
Good answer. So can you tell us a bit about what megafauna are?
So a lot of people consider when walking to a museum that everything big, that's not a living animal is a dinosaur. And that's a good assumption to make, because almost 9 times out of 10, the things you find that are big skeletons are dinosaurs. But many of them aren't. And a lot of them are, in fact, things we call megafauna. And that simply means giant animal, mega being giant and fauna being animal. Now, dinosaurs were all related to one ancestor. They did have an origin, and then they all, many lineages got big, and they all went extinct, or most of them went extinct 65 million years ago, leaving just the birds as their descendants.
I was having this chat with my wife today in the car. She's like, dinosaurs are extinct. And I'm like, no, technically no. Look out the window, you might see one.
That's right. Yeah, you eat them for roast, Sunday roast. You have their eggs every few mornings or something.
Bingo.
And that's the exciting thing about understanding the difference between dinosaurs and megafauna, because megafauna are gigantic animals, but they're not related to one another. And what I mean by that is that they're giant versions of pretty much every sort of animal that we would recognise today. So in Australia, the giant animals, megafauna, that evolved after the time of the dinosaurs. So the dinosaurs are dominating the Earth for 150 million years to 65 million years ago, and then an asteroid hits the Earth. Lots of things change, and the vast number of dinosaurs, except for birds, go extinct. That leaves a huge gap in the market for being a big animal. And so it takes a good 50 million years for the Australian environment to actually produce another big animal. And what it does is, instead of producing another big bunch of animals from a single ancestor, it produces big animals from a whole range of different species. So we had gigantic lizards, we had gigantic birds, gigantic kangaroos, wombats, even huge echidnas, huge koalas, giant snakes, land-dwelling crocodiles, a huge arrangement of weird animals that had evolved in Australia as it was an island. Because after the time of the dinosaurs, Australia splits away from Antarctica, starts to drift northwards, becomes an isolated island, and the animals that it inherited as an island get big. What that means is, by the time people arrive 65,000 years ago, there's been millions upon millions of years of evolution of these crazy big animals that nowhere else on Earth has. So you can't go to North America and find a giant 6-metre-long goanna. You can't go to Europe and find a 2.5-ton wombat. You can only find those in Australia. But in Europe and North America and in Russia and even in northern Africa, you can find giant elephants. You can find saber-toothed cats. You can find hyenas. You can find giraffes and all these crazy big animals, very big megafauna of today, and even bigger ones in the past, but they're all shared across the Northern Hemisphere. The only place that is still, similarly weird is New Zealand, where instead of going for giant mammals, they went for giant birds, and that's where the moa come from New Zealand. Although I'd love to find a giant tuatara one day from New Zealand. That would be very, very cool.
Is that a potential? Is that something that you guys sort of hypothesize is there?
It could be, absolutely. There's giant lizards that evolve on islands all the time, and Australia is a great example of one where the goannas, the monitor lizards, that are actually found right across the globe. Once they get into Australia, for some reason they get really big here and not very big elsewhere. And so that's probably because of the isolation that the island had. So if goannas or monitor lizards ever got to New Zealand, perhaps they would have gotten bigger. And perhaps the tuatara, because it's always been there, could have got big too. But perhaps there's a biological reason why that particular lineage of reptiles didn't get really big. But who knows? It only needs one fossil of a big tuatara to knock that on the head. So there's a whole range of really cool ideas. There's giant iguanas from Fiji, and there's giant tortoises that live off the islands of Pau. There's a big horned tortoise that used to live there.
Do we know much about the process of all of these animals becoming large? Because I imagine that it's herbivores that become large first, and then the predators follow the large prey items and in turn become bigger, and it's a feedback loop like that. Do we know much about how that plays out?
Yeah, it's a bit of an arms race, and that's true. It does seem to be the case that if there's a mechanism that starts to create or evolve large herbivorous plant-eating animals, then those that feed on them have to get bigger, obviously, to take them down, to actually prey upon them.
And they'll get bigger in order to try and avoid the predators that can take them down as well, right?
So body size gets bigger to potentially be a defensive mechanism. But what's interesting is that it's kind of interesting how, which animals that are predatory really do get big. So, for example, the one lineage of megafauna in Australia are the diprotodons, the diprotodontids, the wombat-like. They're not actually wombats. They're related to wombats. Got really big, got to about 2.5 tons. And you've got these contenders of the predators at the time that also got really big. So we had giant lizards. The Guyana megalania was 6 meters long. We had this terrestrial crocodile called quincana that got to about 5 or 6 meters long. And then we have these giant snakes as well, these constricting snakes that are totally extinct now. And we also had the marsupial lion, which again is not a lion. It's a marsupial. It has a pouch, more commonly related, is closely related to koalas and wombats, but was the size of a lioness and probably could climb trees. It had these fantastic gripping claws with these massive recurved claws on its hands, and had meat-cleaving teeth that could bite through bone. So the cool thing is that the Australian fauna solved its issues with predator-prey relationships in a totally different way to anywhere else on Earth. Everywhere else, your lions that started out small got big. The elephants that started out small got big. So the things that you would expect would relate to one another, that would co-evolve large size, predator and prey, are pretty much standard across the northern hemisphere. But in Australia, it's all kind of weird. It's, giant lizards, you don't think of being the top dog predator of the environment. The only big top dog lizard is a Komodo dragon, and it's on an island, and it's capable of taking down buffalo if it nips at its shin and follows it around for 3 weeks. But it didn't evolve specifically to hunt bison or megafauna or buffalo. It actually evolved in Australia 3.5 million years ago to hunt kangaroos and other animals like that. And the reason why the Komodo is venomous and has an anticoagulant venom in its saliva is likely because it evolved to hunt Australian types of prey over non-Australian types of prey. So just like the venomous snakes of Australia have evolved venom for fast bite, fast takedown of small mammals and things, kill as many and quickly as possible so that you don't risk being injured by the prey that you're trying to eat. The Komodo dragon probably evolved the same way. It's using its venom to create an anticoagulant that allows the animal to slowly bleed out.
And get blood poisoning, right, too, from the bacteria in its mouth.
Yeah. Exactly.
And pretty shit way to go.
It's a long, drawn-out, and that's the other thing. And so in Australia, your giant goannas like Megalania evolving at the same time, probably doing the same thing to the big big mammals, the big diprotodons.
Well, they're ridiculous. So I did my master's degree on Varanus varius, which is the lace monitor, the tree goanna, and that's the closest relative to the Komodo dragon. And I remember you would find these animals. So we were tracking them in East Gippsland and weighing them, capturing them and everything. And they can put on half their body weight, sometimes more, from a single meal. So you can
single feed.
They just gorge on it and they get massive. So I can't imagine what it must have been when you had a 6 meter long Megalania goanna eating things like diprotodon or these other huge Procoptodon kangaroos. You know, that would have been horrifying, I can imagine.
Yeah. And that also, you know, that interplay of predator-prey with how many predators are there for prey. I mean, if you think about Komodos on Komodo Island, when one buffalo gets taken down, it's now a feeding frenzy for all of them. They all cruise along and away they go, just ripping them apart.
Well, they have. There's a video I think with Attenborough, right, where that one of them initially has this burst of speed, nips the ankle of whatever animal it is, a buffalo or a deer, and then they form a line of Komodo dragons with the biggest one at the front following this animal, waiting for it to effectively not die but just slow down, right? And then it's
slow enough that they can start to eat it alive. Yeah, I know. It paints a picture of Megafauna Australia 40,000 years ago that you have to have in context in your head when you're thinking about what this would have been like for the first people of Australia to actually meet these animals for the first time. And that's the exciting thing about these studies, is that before this particular research, we concluded it was actually not a done deal that Megalania was even around at the time of people. There was, other than a tiny little bone from underneath the skin of these giant lizards, there was no other fossil that was dated to the same time as Megalania, and not reliably anyway. And so this study, you know, one of the things we really wanted to focus on was, okay, well, our age, the dating of the sites spans between 40 and 60,000 years ago, which is perfect for the correlation for first arrival of people 60,000 years ago in Northern Australia, coming out and dispersing across the continent. So being the first reliably dated tropical megafauna site gives us a first inkling of what might have been the types of species that people actually met. And Megalania was top dog in that case. And it really boggles the mind. I mean, you think about this animal, this giant lizard, not only has it got replaceable recurved serrated teeth with potential venom.
Like a land shark that's poisonous.
Yeah, a land shark that's poisonous. But it also has a chainmail armour. So not a lot of realize that under the skin of these giant goannas, and in fact the laces and Komodos, there's these things called osteoderms, they're little squiggly worm-like bones. And what's neat about them is that they all interweave across the entire body of the animal and across the skull and right along the face. So what that means is that just underneath the skin is this network of armour. So first of all, they're armoured to the nine. They're gigantic animals that are fast moving. They've got huge claws, huge teeth. They're not the terribly most sensitive animals on the planet. They just go for what they want to eat. They're not going to be skittish, and they have a huge long tail for defence. So
yeah, I've witnessed that firsthand too. As a quick anecdote, sorry to interrupt you.
You're right.
We were catching them. I remember taking them out. We'd have to use a dog leash thing with like a pole on it, right, to get it around the neck, keep that tight and hold on to it so that the pointy end didn't come at you. But I remember they curl the tails up as well as hiss, and if you get close, they will just whip the shit out of you with the tail. The other story that we had is I remember we caught one, and quite often they would vomit up whatever they'd eaten. And not only would they eat just things from cicadas, possums, birds, dead animals, whatever it was, we had one once where it vomited up all the spines from a baby echidna. And you were just like, how the hell? It swallowed a baby echidna, all the spines and everything. And it just vomited it up and it was fine. And you just like, these animals are just death proof.
Yeah. Yep. They don't care. They don't care. Although sometimes it doesn't go all the way to plan. We have a specimen at the museum here in Brisbane where it's a parenti goanna.
Yep.
And down its throat, it's got an entire echidna wedged in its throat. spines are actually sticking out of its throat, and it's mummified. So it had a crack at it and probably bit it on the head and did what goannas tend to do and just sort of maneuver itself towards something that's, got an edge, and then just try to shove the animal that's eating down its gob. But of course, the spikes came back and got stuck. But that's the thing. I mean, you can imagine when we had giant echidnas back in the day as well with these megafauna. So what Megalonia ate, how it lived, this is just one of the species. The second one that really blows my mind is this gigantic crocodile that, based on pretty much all of the evidence that we can find so far, was land-dwelling. So it wasn't aquatic. It wasn't an aquatic crocodile. It was.
How do you determine that?
So when you look at its skull, the pieces of its skull and the limb bones, what you see is that the orbits, the eyes, are actually more rotated onto the side of the head. So obviously, if it's like that, it's not going to be aquatic because it'll be under the water. The eyes are usually on the top of the skull for ambush predatory attack from the water's edge. And if the deltopectoral crest, the crest of the upper arm bone, is muscular, it's usually lifting the animal up off the ground for more prolonged sort of crawling or erect style gait across the ground. And so that's what we've found with these gigantic terrestrial crocodiles. The other really interesting piece of information that's sort of not direct evidence but indirect evidence is that most of the really interesting fossils of this particular type of crocodile are found down inside caves, not in river systems or in the floodplains that you would expect a crocodile to be found. So clearly these crocs are at least manoeuvring across the environment to end up down inside the cave. Now, I know crocodiles can, like modern day crocodiles, can move large distances, but we're talking about cave systems where there's cast, sharp limestone cliffs and things. So these animals have to climb and manoeuvre over very large areas a long distance from water. So it's very likely that they were land-dwelling. So there you go. You've got two gigantic predatory reptiles. Then we even had an animal that was at least the size of a Komodo dragon, or it actually was the Komodo dragon living at the same time 40,000 years ago with these guys. Fossils that I've worked on from older sites, 3 or 4 million years old, demonstrate that Komodos originated in Australia and went dispersed westwards across the ocean. So they're fantastic swimmers. They resist huge amounts of salinity. I don't think any sharks are going to care, and crocodiles are probably not going to touch them.
And they don't need to eat, right?
That's right. They don't need to eat for a long time, and they love eating whatever they find. I mean, there's a great clip going around at the moment of 2 Komodo dragons with their heads stuck inside a huge marine turtle, just kind of stuck in there trying to eat the insides out and sort of wandering around with this thing on its head. And it's like, they don't care. They do it. So when you think of a 6-metre version of this is the size of a crocodile and another crocodile that's living out on land, and then a marsupial lion that could probably be arboreal and could give you bear hugs. It just blows your mind what these sorts of animals were. And the fact, and then the next thing you look at is, so imagine as a first Australian, you're rocking up onto the coastline, you've got your family and you're pulled up your canoe or your raft, and you see a beautiful white beach, you've got coral everywhere and there's fantastic fish, palm trees. You walk off into the bush, you start smelling these weird, strange eucalypty, foresty things, and then out of the gloom comes this gigantic bipedal kangaroo that stands 2.5 meters tall. So it's the only animal that you've ever seen that stands on 2 legs like you do, and it carries its kid around in a pouch, and it hops.
Yeah. It's insane, right? I was going to ask you, what do you think was going through their heads? Because if they came through, obviously you were doing this work in places like Mackay, right, in the north of Queensland. And so that's right up the top there where Indigenous people would have come through first before getting to places like Tasmania.
That's right.
What would the interactions have been like to begin with? And a thing that I remember from, I think, Jurassic Park 2 or 3 is where they say, we need to trace the coastline because the biggest animals are on the inside of the island. Is it, and with a really strong Aussie accent there, but was that the same case in Australia where people would have got here and been like, Jesus, like there's huge animals inland, let's just stick on the coastline and stay with the shellfish,
Yeah, that's right. Well, okay, so it's highly speculative, and that's the thing because we have almost zero evidence. There's two things to consider. First is that the cultures that would have been part of the people that first arrived would have had to have been seafaring, would have been coastal, would have been all about seafood and coastal living. So it stands to reason that you're going to go around the coastline and you're going to disperse around the coastline for Australia. And a lot of the archaeological records seems to support that. But there are some very old archaeological records in Central Australia. Now, if you think about it, the coastline at the time wasn't the coastline that we know today, because the sea level at 60,000 to 40,000 years ago was about 100 metres lower.
Yeah.
What that means is the coastline connected from, say, the Kimberleys all the way up to New Guinea. Yep. So you couldn't have gone to Darwin. Darwin was way inland. And there would have been this fantastic sort of almost Rift Valley style riverine system snaking its way out from the Gulf of Carpentaria, which was in fact a lake, which is called Lake Carpentaria. This mega lake right in the middle. And so you would have probably gone around the coast. You could have gone up the river systems. And so if people are dispersing through rivers and of course water, the first thing you notice is that, you know, northern Western Australia at this time was super arid, just like it is today. So these people would have had to have dispersed where there was water and food. And to do that means that you go around the coastline or you go inland to Lake Carpentaria. But if you then follow the rivers from Lake Carpentaria, you actually end up in Central Australia, because you got up the rivers to from Lake Carpentaria, and you're ending up in central Queensland. And so the next rivers that you find are actually going into Lake Eyre, so into Central Australia.
Yeah.
It's quite possible that lots of Central Australia was inhabited much, much earlier than the coastline on the east coast, or alternatively, there was rapid dispersal around the entire continent, even into Tasmania by 40,000 years ago. So what that means is that if people are rapidly moving around the environment, they're rapidly engaging with these megafauna. Whether that means that they were rapidly avoiding them and moving continuously from place to place, or they were rapidly hunting them to extinction, is where the debate rages at the moment, because we have no evidence, or very little evidence, of any interaction with megafauna. Certainly no direct kill sites or the kill site experiences that you see in North America and even in New Zealand with the moa, where you can see chop marks and bones and burnt material and clear evidence of people eating megafauna.
So that would be the smoking gun for that kind of hypothesis, would it? We need to find some kind of fossil that has evidence of human butchering or something, or hunting that's killed that animal.
Well, that would be one bit of evidence. You've got to actually figure out, you've got to not only have interaction with megafauna that is detrimental to that species, as in hunting, butchery, eating, feeding, but you have to have evidence that it was rapid and that it wasn't just a normal, everyday sort of hunting expedition that maybe took down a diprotodon here or a diprotodon there, that caused rapid extinction. And this is the thing, is that the idea is that, you know, that people arrived on the continent, spread out rapidly, and then megafauna died rapidly. So therefore, it was a thing called a blitzkrieg event, where shortly after people arrived, the megafauna go extinct. Well, our study shows that that can't be the case, because if it was the case, by the time people if that was the case, the megafauna at South Walker Creek at this particular site should have been extinct a lot longer previous than they are. So they've survived at least 25,000 years of humans occupying the continent.
So there's a vast overlap, right, between when humans got here. And exactly. It's kind of like with Neanderthals and humans in southeast Europe, right, in that area where it was actually, they were overlapped for 25,000 years. It was a very gradual process. Gradual process, that's right. But what's amazing is that you would also think, if there was lots of people around and there was, you know, rapid extinction and rapid amounts of colonization, if you want to call it that way, you would find lots of archaeology as well. We don't. We actually don't
find any archaeology at all with these fossils. Now, that either says one or two things. Either people are being sensible and not living right next door to a 5-6 meter long goanna or crocodile or whatever in the environment, or they're living far away from the environment in the rock shelters and avoiding the megafauna interaction altogether. Because the other thing that we have been looking for and trying to find is the odd and occasional, and this would be an interesting thing to find, would be bones of people that actually were taken by these giant crocodiles in river systems. Because essentially that would show that there was some sort of engagement, some sort of overlap, but perhaps in the other way, that these megafauna were hunting whatever they could find, and people might have been part of the meal. But we find none of that either. So it's a very odd and very peculiar situation that we find ourselves in Australia. We have almost no evidence of people doing pretty much anything really other than occupying rock shelters, potentially doing a lot of there's a lot of activity as far as rock shelter occupation is concerned, and burning starting around about 25,000 years ago, possibly well after the extinction of these guys. But then there's all these tantalizing things that really excite you, like what about the rock art that shows gigantic animals that potentially people were actually painting? Or what about the Dreamtime stories that are always thought of as mythological, but in fact this shows that it's quite possible that these stories originated as real stories, but then once these animals went extinct, turned into mythology.
How crazy is that idea, right? That they've been passed down. Initially because you would imagine they create these stories, they come to this place, they have these interactions with animals, they create song lines and stories and everything about the land and how to deal with the animals and what not to do. And that gets passed on from generation to generation. And it just keeps going for 60,000 years until present, right? Where now they have a lot of stories about the bunyip, these other mythical creatures that are sort of still occupying places like waterholes, right? So
exactly,
it's incredible to think about.
It changes your context of what these mythological animals are. In fact, you can easily see that if the culture, with the culture being a language-based culture, a songline-based culture, where the information that has to be transferred from generation to generation is in ceremony and connection to country and all these amazing, very deeply seated information, data transferal that's not written, it's painted, sung, it's all these things. And if it started out as actual information saying, don't go there, don't do that, avoid this, you'll survive, which is probably good information to have when you're a young person, trying to set yourself up and figure out where your family's going to live and what you should do with the environment. It's probably good to learn from your elders that you don't really want to mess with a 6 meter long goanna. And these stories then, of course, once the animals go extinct, you've got the stories still there being passed down. You've still got that culture, that tie to the original story. That fascinates me, and it fascinates me for a couple of reasons. One, because as a child, I grew up in the Northern Territory with the Gumatj people from Nhulunbuy, and their totem is the crocodile. It's the saltwater crocodile. And I've had the pleasure and the privilege to be part of ceremonies surrounding very, very important parts of their life and death of individuals and elders that also surround the crocodiles that they live with. And actually individual crocodiles that they would know and understand who they were and have dreaming connected with them for the individuals that they have in their own family. Wow. And so to have that amazing connection and to see the intense emotion that's conveyed to a crocodile that's deceased, a deceased crocodile, as the same level of emotion as a deceased human, as an elder, as a family member, blew me away. It just I couldn't comprehend it as a child. Going, why are all these people crying and wailing around this amazingly huge crocodile that does look scary, sure, but why are they worried so much about this big animal that could clearly eat them? Why are they so sad for it? And now I understand, and I get where these sorts of song lines and these sorts of stories can come from. And having my own connection with country from the point of view of understanding what these animals were and trying to paint a picture of what life was like, you can draw connections, understanding, having a better understanding of Aboriginal people and their storylines and their connection to country through song and ceremony. And that's exciting for me because dinosaurs are cool, and yep, I've named dinosaurs, I've found dinosaurs, and they're really interesting. But they're extinct, and they've been extinct for 65 million years. But the only time in human history that people have been able to meet with and live with reptiles that were equivalent to the size of dinosaurs has been in Australia. And during this period of time when people first arrived. And to me, that whole concept of how they all came together, how they lived together, what happened, how the megafauna influenced culture and how culture influenced the way the species survived or didn't survive, is more interesting and more nuanced than simple debate about did humans come in and butcher them all to death, or did climate change destroy them all. I think it's better for us to look at it from a connection point of view of storytelling and being able to literally draw these lines from 50, 60,000 years ago through to the present, and hopefully make those cultural connections still last today.
So can you tell us about the process of finding these fossils and of fossilization itself, and why it's so rare as an event?
Well, the fossilization of bones is a really interesting thing because it just sort of it's not one type of fossilization fits all sort of thing. You have to take an animal from living to dead and into the ground or buried very rapidly so that the bones and the bits and pieces can be preserved. And especially in a tropical environment like this one, if you have anything left out on the surface, a dead animal, a carcass or something like that, it's going to decay very quickly. And bone, although it's a mineral, once it's exposed to the air and to the sun, it bleaches and breaks apart and splinters. So in the tropics, it's very, very rare to find anything fossilized. And in fact, one of the studies that occurred before this one had suggested that you won't find any megafauna in the tropics, certainly not at the age that we're talking about, because it's too unlikely. Don't worry, don't bother go looking. And in fact, I wouldn't have gone looking in this particular area if it hadn't been for the traditional owners who actually were doing a cultural heritage survey of the land that they were on, of their own land, because an expansion of the BHP mine, South Walker Creek mine. If they weren't doing that cultural clearance, these fossils wouldn't have been discovered. And they found the first fossils sitting on the surface. Now, they identified them as bone. They knew they were fossilized, but they didn't know what they were from. And the reason they were able to identify them as bone is because a lot of the bone that comes from the site actually is pretty much like bone today.
Yeah.
It's sort of pearly white colour. It's got that sort of marrow texture to it. It's got a whole range of really cool features that, say bone. But when you feel it, it's heavier, much heavier.
It feels like a rock, right?
That's right. You might be able to see inside there that the cavity, the marrow cavity that's hollow in our bones but full of blood, gets replaced by sediment. The sediment goes into the bones, and depending on how long it's been under the ground or the compressive forces of the bone and the material, turns it from clay and soft clay into hard rock or clay. So there's another example here. We have a beautiful little vertebra. This is a vertebra from a kangaroo. It's been discoloured by the soil and it's gone a brown colour like rust. But what it's sitting on there is the matrix, the clay that it was totally encased in to begin with. So we've prepared it out and left it sitting on this pedestal of material.
Because most people won't realise that you guys actually need to use like dentist drills to actually expose the bones that you'll end up seeing as fossils out of rock, right?
Well, we're in the lab that we're in, and I'm just looking around to see if I can grab a tool, but you find tiny little dentist drills. So you can imagine going to the dentist and you sit there with your mouth open and the beehives noise is what this lab sounds like during the day, where the preparators, my research assistant, Rochelle, she preps away under the magnifying lamps, preparing out the fossils. So, for example, this specimen here was completely covered in a matrix, but now we can see those little holes?
Yep.
These are actually bite marks or puncture marks.
Wow. No kidding. Crocodile teeth, yeah, because they're incredibly round, right? And they look like they're in line.
Yeah, they're in line. And so here's a croc tooth from the same site, and you can match up the tooth to the hole. So what you can see in this particular specimen, so here we have the limb bone, and this is the other end of the limb bone, clicks together.
No kidding.
Or holes further along. Let me see if I can get this together. There we
How
go.
rare is it to find something like that where you have two species interacting in the form of a fossil like that?
Well, this particular story is really spooky. First of all, this is the first part of the bone that was found in 2008, and it's a whole story in itself. In that, when we first found this, I was walking along the creek, and here this specimen was sticking out of the ground, and I found it. I knew, okay, based on the structure of this part of the bone, that it was an upper arm bone from a giant kangaroo. But then when we saw these puncture marks, we knew it was a crocodile attack that had made that. 10 years later, walking down the same creek, I found this end, and they back together again perfectly. And so what it meant to me, let me see if I can get the click back. There it is. Click.
No kidding.
It goes back together perfectly. And so, 10 years apart, the same paleontologist finds them in the creek. So after 50,000 years, so serendipity, what it shows is that you have to keep going back and you have to keep looking, you have to keep studying to find out what these are. Now, the other part about this animal that's really important is you can see the ends of the bones have these very frayed edges. That's because the caps on the bones have disappeared. They're not fused. So what that means for this mammal is that it wasn't fully grown. So this single bone, which is an upper arm bone from a giant kangaroo.
And for anyone who can't see currently, it's about the size of my forearm, except incredibly thick bone-wise. Yeah.
That's right. So it's a huge, huge bone, and it's not fully grown. So it's not from an adult. So the bones haven't fused, so it's still from a youngster. So what we can say about this story, like a little CSI story, is that giant kangaroo came down to the water's edge one day, was probably drinking. It was not fully grown, might have been part of a mob, and was a sub-adult, and it got taken by a big crocodile, a crocodile with teeth that represent an animal probably in the order of 6 to 7 meters long. The kangaroo itself, when you estimate its size, is probably 2.5 meters tall. So it's just like you would see on a David Attenborough documentary of a saltwater crocodile taking a grey kangaroo, but just blow it up to
by the shoulder too, literally, because it's like it wouldn't have been able to get that animal standing up. The animal had to be bending down, right?
Bending down to the water to drink, gets it by the shoulder. Now, what's interesting is that the bits that we find are what the crocodile didn't swallow, right? So it shakes the animal apart. Mm-hmm. This limb goes flying and then ends up in the water, sinks into the mud, and gets preserved almost immediately. So the reason why fossilization in the tropics can happen is not because it's a good place to bury fossils, but because crocodiles live in the tropics and they love shaking them apart, and their bones get squashed into the mud. So they go from living to dead and then fossilized very quickly.
I guess it's a two-edged blade, right? Because that means that you end up with only ever parts and never the full specimen.
Exactly. So you end up with a crocodile dinner plate, which is an arm here, a leg there, a bit of skull here, so you don't get the whole beautiful skeleton.
Yep.
Very interesting about that is that almost all of the bones that we find at this site have some sort of damage from crocodiles, Thylacoleo or Megalania.
Wow.
We also do find the final part, which is the bits that do get eaten by a crocodile and go through its digestive system, end up as these gigantic poos that are phosphate, almost entirely made of phosphate. So this renders down into almost like a toothpaste-like material, and it fossilizes because it's almost like mineral. So they're called coprolites, and we find fossil fuels in amongst all this stuff as well.
And you still have to use the dentist's toothbrush to get, or the drill to get through it, right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Try and figure out what was in there and what was the last meal. And funnily enough, with crocodiles, they digest pretty much everything. So there's nothing left for you to identify. It's just tube. It's just toothpaste. So fossilization in the tropics is very different to fossilization elsewhere. So if you go to 40,000-year-old sites in the northern Russian Siberia, in the tundra, you'll literally be able to pull out a whole mammoth with hair and cells and seeds that you can start growing. Crazy stuff like that.
Well, I saw something the other day. They found a C. elegans, right? So that tiny little worm, and they reanimated it. So they brought it back to life after 40,000 years of just being frozen there. And obviously it has some sort of protection against dying and having its cells ruptured, and they brought it back. And I've heard of them pulling mammoth out, and the mammoth starts to bleed, and you're just like, incredible. But obviously Australia, the locations need to be incredibly dry as well.
Yeah. I mean, the problem with Australia, it's dry, it's hot, it's got all those problems with it. But we do find some ancient DNA in megafauna bones in the south, in Tasmania, in the colder, wetter, sort of cooler climates, or in the deep caves that are around the south. It's very hard in the tropics to find any of that. In fact, the only DNA that you extract out of these bones are probably from the slobber of the paleontologist looking over them.
Well, that was the trouble I had when I was doing my PhD. We were trying to take it out of rat specimens, and they were only 150 years old, maybe a bit longer. And that was a nightmare in terms of just how degraded it was, broken into little fragments, so I can't imagine tens of thousands of years or even longer. And I was watching a doco about, is it Leanna's Breath Cave on the Nullarbor Plain? I think it was Clay Bryce that was doing work there, and they found a Thylacoleo skeleton. And you think, oh, wow, this is a complete incredible skeleton of Thylacoleo, and they end up dating it because they were trying to take DNA out of it, and they're like, oh, it's 1 million years old. And you're just like...
And it was sitting on a rock. I remember actually back in the year 2002, I saw pictures of that Thylacoleo on the rock. John Long, who was the curator of the West Australian Museum at the time, had been given these images, and I was like, that's insane. This thing looks like it's literally died on the rock yesterday. And so immediately we all assumed that this is going to be the perfect specimen for ancient DNA and all that sort of thing. But hundreds of thousands of years old. And that's what you get for a cave that can open and close. And once it's closed, nothing happens for hundreds of thousands of years. It's those chance discoveries where, it can just be a pinprick of a hole in the massive area of Nullarbor. You just have to have that one person that can squeeze down that hole and go into this huge chamber, shine the light at the right time, see the Thylacoleo, suddenly our whole idea changes on a whim. And that's the thing with these fossils, is that it's almost 99.9% of discoveries are serendipitous. They're by people going somewhere for something else and stumbling across it. And it's our job as paleontologists to try and backtrack to figure out, well, why is it that that's so important? Is that so unique or different relative to the rest of the discoveries that you might likely find? So now that we've found the stuff in the tropics in Western Mackay means that we can look elsewhere. We are going to search further into the tropics to see if we can find similar age sites. There's tantalising little bits of fossil remains that have been found throughout the north of Australia, but no one's really systematically dug. And I mean, it took 12 years for us to get from the first discoveries to the first paper. So you can imagine how long it's going to take to fill up the continental understanding of what these megafauna were doing. And to give you an example or an idea of how much we know and how little we know, if you draw a line from Brisbane to Perth, anything below that line, we almost have, we kind of have an idea. We've got some pretty good sites. But anything above that line, into the Central Australian tropics or even into Papua New Guinea, nothing, almost nothing. We've got spotlet collections of a few bones here and there. We have very few big systematic excavations And anything that we do have that's relatively well known are hundreds of thousands of years old. So most of the sites that we're wanting to focus on, which is during this period of human megafauna interaction, we have zero information on.
Jeez.
And yet, archaeological record is a lot more complete. So if we can somehow find those very rare sites associated close to the rock shelters and overhangs, maybe we can, instead of finding that one site that tells all the story that, you know, we always want to find, which probably never will happen, what we need to do is find the megafauna sites and find the youngest megafauna sites, find the oldest human sites closest geographically together to start to get an idea of, well, how long was the actual overlap at that one spot or this one spot, or what did the climate look like at that exact area through that period of time? Because when you look at the modern day Australian environment today, it's split up into hundreds of different bioregions. And every little region, every little catchment has its unique fauna and flora that's evolved in isolation from others for probably tens of thousands, if not millions of years. And that's going to be the same for the megafauna. The megafauna are a part of that environment. There'll be a few species like Diprotodon that are found everywhere. But most of the animals that we find from this particular site seem to be very unique to that area. Now, that could be because we've only found a few fossils of their species and in the tropics, but it could also be that just like the bioregions of Australia, each catchment, each area is its own little suite of information. So we actually have to look at the whole picture from a biological and geographical frame of mind to go, okay, well, this catchment, the Fitzroy River Basin catchment, that's probably got a bunch of cool fossils and species from it. And this, the Lake Eyre catchment, is going to be different, and the Northern Gulf is going to be different, Kimberley's is going to be different. And to piece that all together is going to take lifetimes worth of work.
Yeah.
But we really crack on with it.
Far out. Well, Scott Hocknull, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, mate. I really appreciate it. It's been really enlightening, so cheers.
Thank you very much.